Hi, it's Mike Mason from Chaosium here. I'm with Chris Lackey, who's the co-author of one of our new books called The Cults of Cthulhu. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Mike. How are you doing?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm great.
Excellent, excellent. So I wanted to sort of get a little bit of background about you and your work on the Cults of Cthulhu book, Chris.
I'm Chris Lackey.
Tell me, why don't you tell us about, what you do and who you are?
I am Chris Lackey. I am the co-host of the formerly H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast, but now transitioning into Strange Studies of Strange Stories. We cover weird fiction, science fiction, fantasy, horror from the turn of the last century mostly, but we stray from that occasionally. We've been going for almost 12 years now. It's been a long time that we've been rocking and rolling. I was also a producer, associate producer on the Call Cthulhu film and the Whisper in Darkness film by the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society. I've written some game stuff for Chaosium before, and a few other game products here and there. And then comic book stuff kind of sprinkled around just for fun as well. But that's what I do.
So a creator of not only writing, but film and all sorts, comics as well. Yeah,
I do. Yeah. All that stuff. I draw. I have a few illustrations in some Cthulhu books.
You've got character illustrations in Pulp Cthulhu, if I remember correctly.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah. And people would know your scenario from the Mansions of Madness book, which is called
The Code.
The Code. That's right.
Yes.
So all marvelous. So check out Chris's stuff, I guess. Want to know more? There's more out there to find, and certainly the podcast is fantastic. So if you're into weird fiction of any stripe, then that podcast is probably one of the number one places to go to, I would say. But
it is definitely the number one place to go.
So drawing from the podcast, cover horror stories, sci-fi, fantasy. Of the three kind of brands that we just said, what's your real passion? Is it horror or is it sci-fi or really fantasy? What would you say?
It depends on the day of the week. Sometimes you want to feel a little horror, you want to feel a little sci-fi, sprinkle on some action adventure, some pulp. I'm a complicated person. One genre is not going to satisfy me.
That's a good answer. What is it about role-playing games that attracted you in the first place and keeps bringing you back? Why role-playing games for you?
That's a great question, which is just a thing to say to give yourself some time to think about things. But for role-playing games, there's this amazing collaborative creative experience that you can only get with role-playing games, where you're both the artist and the observer of it. You're the one that's creating it, but you're also experiencing it because you're doing it with other people. And it's something that also exists, used to only exist in the moment, but now with the internet and people recording their games, that you can see other people performing that. But I personally, what I appreciate it is that the moment of being at a table with a group of people and having this experience that exists just as a flash, and then you get to remember it. It's an adventure that you have with these people, and it's a shared experience. But it's like writing, it's like acting, it's all of these things kind of mixed in together, but it's its own unique art form that I am still in love with. I started playing when I was a little kid. My dad played Dungeons and Dragons in the 70s, and I, was not on his knee, but next to him and throwing some dice and looking at the miniatures, and they doing some mapping for them. I remember was lots of fun for me. And then, there's all these different games came out. I remember Marvel Superheroes was one of the first games that I picked up that wasn't Dungeons and Dragons, and Star Frontiers. And then, of course, Call Cthulhu came a bit later for me. I think it was with 4th edition. When 4th edition came out, I got really into it. A friend of mine said, "Oh, you like role-playing games, have you tried Call of Cthulhu? And I'm like, what is that? That sounds a mouthful. Oh, you play librarians in the 1920s fighting monsters. And I'm like, why would anybody want to do that? And he goes, read the book, read it. And I did, and I was hooked. And that's how I discovered Lovecraft, because I know, like lots of people, Lovecraft was really obscure back in the 80s. He's not as popular as he is now. That I found this crazy writing and these elder gods and the Necronomicon and all this stuff was from Lovecraft, and it was through the game. And I know tons of people have found Lovecraft through the game, and I'm one of them. And so Cthulhu has got a very personal kind of connection for me. So like the role-playing game, the Call of Cthulhu, because it's brought me so many hours of joy. That's kind of when I became really good friends with Chad, was through theater, but we play Call of Cthulhu together. That was one of the things that we did. And now we're in our late 40s and still doing it, still rocking the Lovecraft. It's great stuff.
Marvelous. So kind of drawing things towards the Cults of Cthulhu book. So you were the primary writer. We had a conversation, and I kind of twisted your arm a bit and said, hey, why don't you write a book about the Cthulhu cult? And you kind of went, okay. And then we chatted about it, and you kind of drew up a rough plan, and then you went off. But so that's all kind of like the history. But let's talk about the process. So when you first sort of sat down to think about what this book might be, or what would be in it, what was your kind of, was there a process, or did you just kind of throw ideas at the wall, or how did you kind of approach it?
Well, I think what was important to me is that it is something that is entertaining and useful. So that's kind of one of the first things that I was thinking about, because when I get a source book, I play lots of different role-playing games, and I know what I want out of a book. So I wanted to make sure that was going to be in this book, that if it's called Cults of Cthulhu, it's got to have stuff in there about having your own cults, making cults from the ground up. Sure, they're going to worship Cthulhu, but in what way are they going to worship Cthulhu? How is that going to look? Are they going to be like a low-level street cult? Are they going to be a high society cult? All these things, they have to link together in some way. So I thought, first we need some mechanics for helping people design their cult. So I looked into, organizations and how they're structured, just generic businesses or religions, churches. And then I read about some real cults as well. I didn't want to get too deep into that, because that's sort of really sad and depressing, the real cult stuff. So this is kind of a more Lovecraftian, crazy, magic slinging, monster worshiping type of thing. And I wanted to stick to that. So then I went to the source, because, Lovecraft's the guy. I went and read about all the cults that he mentioned in all of his stories. So I did a fine-tooth comb, going through, taking all the bits and info that I could, and try to figure out, piecing those together, what are some of the common denominators. And then I wrote a bit of a history on that. I went through history as well, trying to find other weird cult things to use as inspiration. So the first part of the book has got a history of Cthulhu cults, which is partially Lovecraft, but also just a bunch of stuff that I made up from inspiration from other cults in history, and to kind of give people ideas on what they might do with their cult when they come up with something, like adventure seeds. And then the next part of the book was about existing cults that Lovecraft came up with, like the Louisiana Swamp Cult or the Esoteric Order of Dagon. And then I came up with a few other cults to sort of fill in the gaps with that. And then there's this whole sort of worksheet area of the book where you can kind of get you through the steps of it. And I don't have all day as a keeper to read all this stuff. And I wanted to keep it as simple and approachable as possible, keep in the fun stuff, get rid of all the heavy work. And then there are 3 scenarios that are loosely linked together that start from the Gaslight era up until modern times. And then that's pretty much the whole book. But as I was working that way, those are sort of the things that got me to what we had before us. And I sent you that outline, and you said, "Hey, this sounds great. Let's do it." And then it was just a matter of putting the nose to the grindstone.
Sure. In terms of, you've kind of given a really good overview of, what people can expect to see in the book in terms of, a history of different cults, some kind of really kind of fleshed out cults that come from either Lovecraft stories or inspired, how to craft and build a cult to use in your games, as antagonists for your investigators, and then scenarios and so forth. What if I got to pin you down, which bit did you enjoy the most? Was there a particular kind of part of the book that you really enjoyed, or was it just this massive slog and you we're just glad?
Oh no. I really enjoyed pretty much all of it. The stumbling block was writing the adventures. Those are hard because they require playtest, and playtest requires you processing feedback and rewriting, and then playtesting again, feedback, rewriting. So that was a lot more work than, I mean, I've written a adventure, but having 3 adventures going, and they're pretty big. They're not sort of smaller ones. That was a lot of work, but I really enjoyed the research and going through Lovecraft. I mean, that's what I do on the podcast is I'll read something and I'll get into it, and something will lead me to another thing, and then I'll read that and then take it. So that was all really fun. And obviously coming up with a system of creating a cult, I thought that was really interesting. And as a writer, that's something that I think that this book, you maybe you don't even play Call of Cthulhu. I feel like you can get this book and it would help you come up with some really cool villains. And I think that cults they're pretty ubiquitous in Call of Cthulhu. A cultist is almost every adventure. There's going to be some kind of cultist. So why not have a book that focuses on people that have aligned themselves with the mythos, and really think about who these people are, what their motivations are, why are they doing this as opposed to any other thing that might change your life? Like, why aren't you working harder on your business instead of, sacrificing dogs to the thing in the cellar? These are people, and every cultist is a person with hopes and dreams and desires that they want fulfilled. And when you start to think about those things, there's stories. Like, there's so many stories in that. Like, you've got a cultist, he's got the kids at home, and he's got a day job that he's got to hold down, and he wants to feed them. And how does that all work? And if he makes a mistake, where does he slip up? Does he slip up in his cult activity? Does he slip up at home? There's so much that's going on there, and there's so many stories that I thought that stuff is really fascinating. And I hope that that's captured in the process of this book. When you go through it and make your own cult, that you'll think about these things as a keeper. You'll go and make solid characters that are going to be interesting for your investigators to come up against.
Yeah, absolutely. Was there, do you have any, were there any memorable moments in playtesting? Were there any, did anything happen during playtesting that significantly surprised you or made you change something? Was there any kind of memorable moment, I guess?
It's fun. It's fun to play test. The rewriting, that's the hard part. when they find the holes in your adventures, or like, wait, if this person did A, then wouldn't that mean B? And you're like, oh, rats. Yeah, of course that would be true. That makes perfect sense. Why didn't I think of that? I'm going to have to rewrite now and go back and figure these things out. But generally, the people that I play test are people that I know. They're friends that game, and I know lots of gamers because I've been gaming for so long. So it's in with Skype or Discord or Roll20 or any of these online gaming things. It's so much easier to play test now because you're not stuck with location. You can just find some people and jump on it. The one that I felt like was the most fun, or the ones that had the kind of more gonzo aspects to it, were the modern day setting, where people were just every single time it was something different. And that is sort of the fun of a role-playing game, but it's also the bane of the writer, because you're trying to anticipate what people are going to do, and yet they're gonna do their own thing. And so you have to have provisions in store for whatever crazy thing that might go on that could derail the plot, or end the game in the first hour, as opposed to the 3 or 4 hour session that you're going to have. And sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. People will try and blow up a house, and get arrested by the police, or they're on the run and it becomes a completely different scenario than it was supposed to be, where now it's just about them not getting arrested and fighting a cult. But those things are always exciting, and it's different. We play tested so much that it's hard to remember any specific thing that happened, but it's always interesting and it's always exciting, and it is a pleasurable experience to be a part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I find it very informative, as you say. It's
yeah,
and that, I think you illustrate the kind of one of the kind of beauties of role playing is that you have a scenario with the nuts and bolts and the characters and the locations and the kind of the plot. But how each player group interacts with those elements is different every time. And as you say,
it is.
One could be a running battle between them and the cult. One could be a kind of a much more kind of cloak and dagger kind of enterprise where they're infiltrating or what, and they're very different styles of games in a way. But it's what's the beauty of role playing in Call of Cthulhu in this manner is that you can adapt the scenarios to the style that the players want to go with, and the circumstances of the story that they're kind of creating from these seeds effectively. So
yeah.
Did is there a obviously the 3 scenarios? There's the one set in Gaslight, London, the 1920s California, and modern day New England, I'd say, area, isn't it? Really, it's the it's completely escaped me where it's set. Where's it set?
Chicago.
I knew it wasn't Boston, but I kept thinking of Boston. I didn't want to say Boston because I knew it wasn't right. Chicago, of course, yeah, up there. So of the 3, is there a particular, I mean, you sort of said in playtesting that the modern one was quite memorable. Which of the 3 do you think, which kind of era of play do you enjoy the most, I guess, in terms of when playing the game?
Yeah, it's still the 1920s. It really is more evocative of the original material, and this having that distance, not having cell phones or technology to rely on, I think is pretty cool. And there's something sort of more frightening, I guess, or more raw about being in the 20s, where taking a car somewhere, you're lucky if you can hit 30 miles an hour most of the time on these journeys, and there's not a lot of roads, and it gives you some of the cool modern things like guns, but it also and telephones. There's telephones exist, but there is also that kind of that distance. So you're when people are out at a mansion somewhere, they really are out there on their own. There's no connectivity like we have in our modern stories, and it becomes a different kind of story once you become part of a modern world, because there's so much information that's available now with the internet and everything, that if there's hidden esoteric things out there, there's a reason why they're hidden, and there's powers that be that keep them hidden. And you can accidentally have I can believe the Necronomicon is something most people don't know about in the 1920s, and it's a really rare book, and there's only a few copies of it. But by the 1960s or 70s, if you've got a copy of the Necronomicon, somebody could just get in and take photographs of every page, and then it's out on the net, and then it becomes a whole other story at that point in a modern setting, which is cool. I love those stories, but there's something more simple and I guess pure about those 1920s and 30s stories, that era.
Sure. And I'm sure a lot of people agree. But I think it's nice to have the different timescales, because as you say, you can, although they're not designed that you have to play them all together in a campaign, there is a kind of a loose, as you say, linking thread through them, and it's nice to kind of experience the different kind of areas and the challenges each era kind of poses for the players in the game itself. So it's quite interesting how that kind of works through. I did want to touch on monsters very shortly, because you've talked about the book really being about humans. It's about, you know, human motivations of why people do this and how that affects the game world and so on. But I detected that when you were going through, you know, some of the original Lovecraft stories, like the Call of Cthulhu story, you actually picked out some new monsters that nobody's really used before. You know, the black-winged ones, for instance, and so on. And so the book does have a few kind of new kind of, you know, I guess the word would be Cthulhu aligned monsters to kind of you know, throw in as you need. How did tell me about, you know, writing the monsters.
Well, in the Call of Cthulhu, you've got the black winged ones, the black winged things, and I know a lot of people think they're night gaunts. And I think maybe at one point I did too, but in the descriptions of them, they don't seem to be night gaunts. Maybe they are. It's possible that they are, and that's sort of the feeling of you're not certain, the unknowableness of it. So, but these things have a very specific purpose. Like they came out of caves somewhere in the Louisiana swamp, and they come up and then they picked up people, they killed things, they ate them, then they went away. It doesn't sound very night gaunty. That doesn't sound like something a night gaunt would do. So I thought, well, let's just say they're not night gaunts and let's make it into another creature. And there was also the white thing that was out in the swamp as well, which is again just a line or two in the story. You don't get much information about it, but what is that? And I know a lot of people like to think that maybe it was a Shoggoth or something, because there is connections with Shoggoths and Cthulhu cults. They mentioned in the Shadow over Innsmouth how the Deep Ones have Shoggoths working with or for them. They don't, it's again ambiguous. But I go, what is this polypus white thing out in the swamp? That's interesting. So still, after all these years of Call of Cthulhu, there's a few unmined gems out there. So I thought maybe this is a good opportunity to take those and extrapolate them, as well as flesh out a few other creatures for some other scenarios and locations that I thought, you know, could be necessary. But again, these creatures work with cults. So that's kind of what's important about these things, is that they're important to a cult for one reason or another, and that's sticking with the theme.
Yeah, sure. So if you were the high priest of a Cthulhu cult, Chris, you know, it could be any era, you know, you pick the era, but tell what you know, you design many different kind of Cthulhu cults now in this book. What would your cult look like?
The cult that I personally would be in,
so the one that you started to
that I would write for a game
to worship Cthulhu. What you know? Why Cthulhu? What you know?
Yeah, well, Cthulhu. The promise of Cthulhu seems to be that you will learn new ways to appreciate life. You will somehow maybe become elevated in some sense, like you'll get some sort of greater understanding of the universe and your place therein. And that if you do nice things, that Cthulhu will favor you and you will be like Cthulhu in some way. These are the things that Castro was saying in the Call Cthulhu story. So that's the one guy who's a cultist is like going, okay, these are the reasons why a Cthulhu cult would be rad, or at least that version of his Cthulhu cult. Who knows what Cthulhu is telling his other cultists, if anything. These people might just be coming up with stuff on their own and thinking, hey, Cthulhu sounds rad. Let's make him the centerpiece. He's got that great squid head. He's got those 6 eyes, you know, cool logo. It'd be great. So I guess if I was going to do a Cthulhu cult, I would think about, boy, that's pretty evil. So it's really hard to think evil. So maybe I would get political with it. I think that would be an interesting cult, because the cult of politics is something that it seems pretty apparent in our current climate. So to maximize that, I would find people that are open to influence with social media and use that to get people on my side, to give me not only money and resources to fund my cult, but bodies that would actually go out there and do the things that need to be done, be it sacrificing or finding magical items or whatever it is that needs to happen.
So as the high priest, you've got your own secret personal motivation. So
oh yeah.
So is it really elevation by Cthulhu? Is it power you're after? Is it money? Is it influence or whatever? What would be your key motivator, do you think?
Immortality, hands down. I want to be. Who wants to live forever? This guy wants to live forever. I answer that, queen. That is the answer. Me. I want to live forever. So that's my motivation, because if you're not going to die, because you've got that ticking clock, you've got, well, me, I've maybe got 40, 50 years if I'm lucky left. That's nothing. That's peanuts. I got to figure out how to not die and then figure out what you want to do next. So do you want to get more power? Do you want more wealth? Do you want to influence society? Do you want to align yourself with these other forces, or do you want to fight against them? Maybe a little column A, a little column B, who knows? But that idea that you're going to die, I think, is the thing that would stop your plans, that you need to figure out a way to not die, and then you can move on with the bigger scale things.
Absolutely. Sounds good. Where do I sign up? Fantastic. Well, thanks, Chris. Before we go, just thanks again for your insights, and just remind people where they can hear more of you on the interweb.
Yeah, you can go onto Patreon. That's where we get all the good stuff, or you can just go to hppodcraft.com or strangestudies.com. Those are the two places to find. And then me, chrislackey.co.uk is another place where you can find other things that I've done over this time. But if you just search me in Google, I'm the first guy that shows up.
There you go. Chris is everywhere, just like Cthulhu.
I'm everywhere.
Thanks very much, Chris. I'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Mike. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.